Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on theory and methods, examining objectivity and subjectivity in research. The question of objectivity and subjectivity in sociology is part of a wider debate looking at the roles of values in sociology and whether sociology can be value-free or is inevitably going to be value-laden, that is, influenced by the values of the sociologists, the funding body, the research participants, etc. Some sociologists believe that it is possible to objectively examine society and have a value-free approach if sociologists use scientific, quantitative research methods. Critics of this approach would suggest that sociology cannot be value-free and shouldn't try to be. They suggest that even seemingly objective facts are based upon subjective judgments, and in this video we're going to look at both sides of this debate, drawing on positivist and interpretivist approaches and examining the ideas of Goldner and Weber on objectivity and subjectivity. One of the first attempts to examine society from an objective viewpoint was Durkheim's research into suicide. He argued that by observing social facts, sociology could rival the natural science for objectivity and develop a science of studying society and social behaviours. Durkheim suggested that by examining quantitative data in the form of comparing official statistics on suicide, he could draw conclusions about the reasons why people committed suicide. He examined a broad range of data, using what was known as the comparative method, to examine social differences between the victims of suicide, noting differences between suicide rates in rural and urban populations, between different religious practices, by age, and by marital status. By using numerical data, Durkheim suggested that this removes subjective interpretations and used the social trends to establish causal relationships to explain the differences between different social groups. This practice was seen as objective at the time, as Durkheim was not looking at individuals, rather examining numerical data that clearly demonstrated trends in the rates of suicide between these groups. However, Durkheim's method was far from objective according to critics. Each suicide recorded, or not recorded, was based upon the decision of a coroner, and they would make subjective judgments based upon their common sense view of the world, according to Douglas. This meant that the data Durkheim was analysing was based upon thousands of subjective judgments and was argued to be a social construction. It was also further argued that Durkheim was influenced in his research by his own values. A close friend of Durkheim's had committed suicide, and this was thought to have inspired his research, meaning he had a subjective attachment to the topic. Durkheim has also been criticised as his methodology was teleological in nature. In other words, he took the effects, suicide rates, and tried to find a cause, rather than developing a hypothesis and testing it. This made his research impossible to falsify, and therefore was seen as unscientific. What this demonstrates is that assumptions of objectivity assigned to quantitative methods are often influenced by subjective judgments. If this is true, can sociology, or science for that matter, claim to be objective? Positivists would argue that objectivity is possible in research, even sociological research. However, they would argue that we can only measure behaviour that can be directly observable, physical actions and behaviours that observers can record. By using the scientific methods, individuals can be manipulated and the behaviours recorded and analysed to try and predict future behaviours. Objectivity can be achieved by detaching the researcher from data collection and allowing this to be conducted by parties that are neutral, which is why positivist methodologies focus on structured questionnaires and interviews and non-participant observations, methods that can be replicated by others following standardised instructions, and they would obtain similar data to the original. The ability to test and retest a hypothesis makes it more reliable and removes the influence of researcher bias if others are conducting the research. Another feature of positivist methodology that focuses on maintaining an objective viewpoint is the use of numerical data, that only allows for mathematical interpretations which are more objective than analysing contextual data. However, as we've already seen, quantitative data is often based upon subjective interpretations, which challenges the assumption that quantitative data is objective. Interpretivists would disagree with positivists on both objectivity being desirable or achievable. They suggest that the nature of research needs to be subjective, as the purpose of sociology is to understand the meanings and motivations that people assign to acts. As these differ from person to person, by their very nature, these meanings will be subjective judgments. Interpretivists also suggest that objectivity when studying human behaviour is impossible, as human beings are not predictable and cannot be measured using scientific methods. Whereas if we heat a piece of metal, it will always perform the same actions. Acting in a certain way towards different individuals will yield different reactions based upon their personality, their history, their emotional state. Furthermore, interpretivists would suggest that even in the observation of measurable behaviours, we should be looking to understand the meanings and motivations behind these actions. Knowing what somebody has done is only part of studying individuals. We also need to know why they have done it. Finally, interpretivists would argue that subjectivity is desirable in research, as the role of sociology is to document the experiences of others and how they view the world. And the only way to achieve this is to gain an insight or verstehen into their view of the world. One way of addressing the issue of objectivity and subjectivity in research was proposed by Gouldner, who suggested a form of committed sociology. Gouldner suggested that sociologists would always be influenced by their values when choosing topics, as they were influenced by their theoretical and methodological preferences, meaning that they would always be subjective. But by stating these values at the outset of the research, sociologists would have the opportunity for their peers to conduct analysis of how they carried out the research, to see if their values had influenced any part of the research being conducted. This allows the research process itself to remain objective, whilst it is understood that the sociologist will have a subjective interpretation. Sociologists and researchers in other fields, including the natural science, are influenced by too many other variables to remain objective, with issues such as existing paradigms, the role of funding bodies, a researcher's own interests, and their career aspirations all potentially impacting on their choice of research topic. By declaring these interests, they can be seen as subjective, but the design, conduct and findings of their research can be judged separately to be objective. Similarly, Weber suggested that sociology must strive to be value-free in its research. Whilst Weber suggested that the choice of topic and theoretical approach and choice of methods are inherently subjective, researchers must consider the findings of their research in an objective manner and reject their hypothesis if their research could not prove it. Weber also suggested that if sociologists reject their hypothesis if unproven, this can lead to the development of new theories and therefore enhance the knowledge base of sociology. Whilst he acknowledges that sociologists are unlikely to be objective, Weber suggested that their research always should be, holding sociologists to the highest moral and ethical standards. For Weber, data, whether quantitative or qualitative, should be collected and analysed in an objective manner. Now we have to evaluate the debate between objectivity and subjectivity, and in doing so we should draw on the ideas of positivists, interpretivists, Gouldner and Weber. For positivists, they suggest that sociologists should be detached from their choice of topic, which allows them to put aside their own personal interests and conduct the research in an objective manner. This can be argued to be the case for many early career scientists, who will be guided on research projects by senior academics. In order to progress their careers, they may join a research topic that is not in their field of interest, allowing them to be more objective about the findings. Gouldner argues that in these instances, the sociologist is not being objective, as they are still influenced by their career aspirations and wanting to please senior academics. They may also be influenced by the demands of the funding bodies, institutions that Gouldner argues have the greatest influence in the choice of topic and method in sociological research. And this may mean that the researcher is objective, but the interests of the funding bodies lead to the researcher being based upon their desires. Interpretivists such as Becker would suggest that sociology is not objective, and nor should it be. The role of sociology is to reflect the interests of those being studied, and the relationships that they have with those that control them. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on objectivity and subjectivity in research. Thanks for watching.